Okay, good morning. I'm going to show another movie today, but not till a little bit later in the class. We'll get it. We'll get there. Don't worry. It doesn't fit until the last part of the class. But today I want to talk about sovereignty. There are two great concepts that come out of Hobbes that you have to remember. One is the state of nature, and the other is sovereignty. I spoke a bit about the first one yesterday, or Monday rather. Today I want to talk about Hobbes' theory of the sovereign state. The creation of the sovereign. Hobbes refers to the sovereign as a mortal god. Is his answer to the problems of the state of nature, the condition of life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And it is only the creation of the sovereign for Hobbes, endowed or possessed with absolute power, that is sufficient to put an end to the condition of perpetual uncertainty, anxiety, and unrest that is the case of the natural condition. Let me talk for a while about some of the formal features of Hobbes' sovereign power, of the Hobbesian state. In the first place, what I want to impress upon you is that the sovereign is for Hobbes less a person than it is, or he is, an office. The sovereign is described by Hobbes as an artificial person, by which he means the sovereign is the creation of the contract or the covenant that brought this office into being. The sovereign does not exist by nature, but rather, Hobbes tells us again, the sovereignty is the product of art or science. He's the product, the creation of the people, or of what we might call in Jeffersonian language, he is a product of the consent of the governed. The sovereign, and again this is crucial, is for Hobbes the representative of the people. He is the sovereign representative. It is the people who endow the sovereign with the authority to represent them on their behalf. And in that respect, Hobbes' sovereign has many of the features or characteristics that we come to associate with what we call modern executive power or executive authority. When Louis XIV of France famously said, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, he was expressing a peculiarly pre-modern, in that way, conception of the state. That is to say, he regarded the state as in some ways his personal property. I am the state. I am the state am I. But this is very different from Hobbes' sovereign. The state for Hobbes is not the possession of the sovereign. Rather, the sovereign does not own the state. He is appointed or authorized to secure for the people the, in many ways, limited ends of peace and security. He has much the same function and, to some degree, much of the same personality as what we would call a modern-day CEO. That is to say, there is a kind of anonymity and impersonality about the sovereign. I mean, unless you're in the Yale Entrepreneurial Society, who can name the CEOs of many companies? And the answer is you probably can't. They are, for the most part, relatively anonymous individuals, unless they get into trouble like Ken Lay or someone like that, or do something amazing like Bill Gates. For the most part, they are rather impersonal and anonymous. And that is in many ways the characteristic of Hobbes' sovereign. Hobbes' theory of the sovereign interestingly contains within itself elements of both secular absolutism and in some ways modern liberalism. And it is the tension between these two that I want to bring out in my discussion here. The power of the sovereign, Hobbes continually insists, must be unlimited. Yet at the same time, he tells us that the sovereign is the creation of the people whom he represents, or it represents. although Hobbes is widely taken to be a defender of monarchical absolutism, you will note in your readings that he displays a kind of studied neutrality over actually what form the sovereign should take. He only insists that sovereign power remain absolute and undivided, whether it belongs to a single person, a few, or the many. And among the powers that the sovereign, he insists, must control are, for example, laws concerning property, the right of declaring war and peace, what we would call foreign policy, rules of justice concerning life and death, which is to say criminal law, and of course the right to determine what books and ideas are permissible, that is to say the right of censorship. In a sense, the core of Hobbes' theory of sovereignty can be boiled down to the statement that the sovereign, and only the sovereign, is the source of law. The law is what the sovereign says it is. Does that sound in any way familiar from what we have read this term? Anyone? Sound familiar? Thrasymachus? Do you remember that name? Book 1 of the Republic. Justice is what the stronger say it is. Hobbes tells us that the law is what the sovereign commands. This is sometimes known as the doctrine of legal positivism, which is to say that law is the command of the sovereign, a sort of command theory of law. And again, that seems to point back to Thrasymachus' point of view in the first book of the Republic. There is, for Hobbes, as for Thrasymachus, no higher court of appeal than the will or the word of the sovereign. No transcendent law, no divine law, no source of authority outside sovereign command. The sovereign is appointed for Hobbes to be much like an umpire in a baseball or a football game, to set the rules of the game. But the Hobbesian sovereign, unlike umpires, are not just the enforcers of the rules or the interpreters of the rules. The sovereign is also the creator, the shaper and maker of the rules. And Hobbes draws from this the startling conclusion, in many ways the infamous conclusion, that the sovereign can never act unjustly. The sovereign can never act unjustly. Why? Because the sovereign is the source of law. And if the sovereign is the source of the rules of justice, therefore, Hobbes concludes he can never act unjustly. And he supports this example by a deeply perverse and amusing, I have to say, reading from a biblical story. Do you remember this? He refers to the story of David and Uriah. Everybody will remember that story from Sunday school or Hebrew school or whatever. Does anyone remember that David was the king at that time? He was the king of Israel. And he coveted Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. He wanted to sleep with Bathsheba. So what did he do? He had Uriah killed so he could sleep with her. And Hobbes reasons from this story that while David's action may have sinned against God, he did no injustice to Uriah. Imagine that. I think Uriah might have had a different point of view about this. He did no injustice to Uriah because as the lawful sovereign, he could do not just anything he liked, but whatever he did was set by the rules of the law. And when Hobbes tells that story, which he mentions a couple of times in the book, one can only imagine he must have had a kind of wry grin on his face when he wrote that out. In fact, next semester I'm teaching an entire course devoted to Hobbes' critique of religion, in which this will, among other things, figure prominently. But Hobbes's teaching about law is in some ways less draconian than it might at first appear. He makes clear that law is what the sovereign says it is. There can be no such thing as an unjust law, he infers. Again, because the sovereign is the source of all justice. But he does distinguish, he tells us, between a just law and a good law. All laws are by definition just, he tells us, but it doesn't follow that all laws are by definition good. A good law, he says, chapter 30, is that which is needful for the good of the people. A good law is needful for the good of the people. But then one asks, what are the criteria by which we determine the good of the people? How is this determined? And Hobbes makes clear that the sovereign is not invested with the authority to exercise a kind of absolute control over everything the people do. The purpose of law, Hobbes tells us, is not so much to control, but to facilitate. Consider just the following passage from chapter 30, section 21. Hobbes writes, "For the use of laws, which are but rules authorized," he says, "is not to bind the people from all voluntary actions." It is not to bind them from voluntary actions, but to direct and keep them in such motion as not to hurt themselves by their own impetuous desires, rashness, or indiscretion, as hedges are set not to stop travelers, but to keep them on their way. This is the force or purpose of law, to set rules, to keep people, as he puts it, on their way. A law that is intended simply to constrain and control for its own sake, Hobbes says, cannot be a good law. The purpose of a good law is to facilitate human agency in some ways. And I think, again, that too is central to Hobbes's theory.